Welcome to EB-5 Investment Voice, where attorney insights intersects with immigration investments. If you are a foreign investor, domestic fund manager, or enterprising entrepreneur and want to get the most out of the EB-5 program, you have come to the right place. I'm Mark Deal, and I'll be your co-host on this journey. I'm joined by your host, Mona Shaw, and other attorneys at Mona Shaw & Associates, as well as immigration leaders from around the world. So let's get into EB-5 Investment Voice. Well, as January comes to a close and we're 1 month into 2020, we're all really busy. And that includes USCIS. They are really busy, but it seems they're busy issuing RFEs, requests for evidence. And a lot of those, according to what you're telling me, Mona and Rebecca, are originating, or at least coming out of issues and concerns around third-party transfers. Could you share some more light on that for us?
Yes, Mark. Rebecca, we've seen a real increase in RFEs with relation to the transfer of investment funds for EB-5 investors, right?
Yes, we have. Not that third-party parallel transfers is not new. We have seen it in the past, and it just seems to continually happen now, and it seems that we're getting more and more on this issue, as USCIS wants to make sure that the funds that are coming into the U.S. are legally and lawfully earned, even from the third-party person.
Right, but the issue is that some countries really have tightened their regulations, like China. China created regulations at the beginning of, I believe, 2017 that mandated discovery for the requested currency exchange and proof that it was not for immigration or on behalf of another individual. The third-party transfers then had to become very creative in order to avoid that regulation. And now USCIS requires third parties assisting investors, like the third-party parallel transfers, to provide proof of their legitimate fund sources. This really is complicating the process with regards to transferring funds.
Yeah, very much so. It's almost as if you're completing a whole new source of funds, because you do have to source, not just providing one or two documents. When the issue first came about, early last year, we were providing one or two documents to help supplement, to show that these funds were legitimately earned by the third party. But now USCIS this year, third week into it, and they're already asking for way more documents than what we were providing before.
Well, that's for previous cases, but moving forward, we've discussed this before, Mark, Rebecca, haven't we, about cryptocurrency and digital currency. But I feel like the whole atmosphere has changed somewhat now.
I would think so.
Yes, I think, especially in the immigration realm, I think USCIS have done their due diligence. A few years ago, who knew what digital currency was? I think they have researched what is it, what's happening, how can we prove the sources on digital currency? And so I feel that USCIS is now a little bit more open to the idea of cryptocurrency.
Well, we want to get into this a little bit today. And with us, we have a guest who's very proficient on this knowledge. Max, welcome to the show.
Hi, Mona. Hi, Rebecca. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be part of your show.
That's right. Today on the show, we welcome Max Dilendorf. Max's practice involves complex real estate transactions, blockchain, cryptocurrencies, and security token offerings, otherwise known as STOs. He's an invited speaker and advisor on the subject of STOs and regulatory aspects of blockchain technology to government and private institutions such as IBM, HSBC, Berkshire Hathaway, NYU, the Thailand Securities and Exchange Commission, and now to you right here on EB-5 Investment Voice. Again, Max, welcome to the show.
Mark, thank you so much for a wonderful intro. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's a long time overdue. The last time we spoke about cryptocurrencies was back when Bitcoin was valued at about $3,000 before the big bubble. And now here we are after. I think we all have at least a little bit of exposure to it. And I'm glad we have you with all the experience.
Max, what countries are we seeing to be most popular with cryptocurrencies? I know some countries like Iceland prohibit it.
Well, I think, all of them are popular. It depends from what angle we looking at cryptocurrencies. So my firm jumped into blockchain and cryptocurrencies back in 2017. So since then, we've seen a lot of changes from the regulatory perspective, both in the US and outside of the United States. But one thing for sure is that, regulators and, like IRS, FinCEN, immigration services are getting comfortable around the concept of cryptocurrencies, how to regulate them, how to look at them. And I think this is the trend not only in the US, but all over the world. It's we see it in Asia, we see it in Southeast Asia, Russia and Europe. So,
well, Max, for our listeners who are not really sure or don't know much about digital currency, I know digital currency allows individuals to send funds electronically without using a bank or other financial institution. But how does it actually work? Very briefly.
Well, the most popular type of digital currency is Bitcoin, right? So what is Bitcoin? Bitcoin it's a software. So we can look at it as a decentralized software that's operated not by one centralized party like a bank that processes all the transactions, but it's being processed by thousands of computers at the same time. And those computers are called miners. So for verifying transactions on the network, they mine a piece of Bitcoin.
But Bitcoin isn't a physical object like a pound or a euro, right?
Mona, you're absolutely right. It's a piece of a code. So when I send to you, for example, one Bitcoin, right, it goes from one wallet to another wallet, and we have thousands of computers on the network approving the transaction simultaneously. And therefore, it's said that it's impossible to hack the network because we have thousands of computers, or maybe 2,000. It depends on how big the transaction is, are verifying a transaction.
So Bitcoin can be used, for example, but can it be used for, say, buying real estate in these countries? Say somebody comes from Australia. I know it's used quite frequently in Australia. Can you use Bitcoin in the United States to buy property?
Every single property in the United States can be purchased for Bitcoin. Absolutely every piece of property. So there are different ways that you can structure a transaction. One of the ways is where a seller will be accepting a cryptocurrency and exchanging a cryptocurrency for his or her property. Another way is, let's say, when we have a non-US resident or foreign investor that has Bitcoin or other type of cryptocurrency, they can pay with Bitcoin for property, but Bitcoin will be automatically converted into US dollars and the seller will be accepting dollars. So from the seller's perspective, nothing changes, but it can be said that a transaction was structured using Bitcoin or other type of crypto.
Well, the reason I use the example of property is because when we talk about EB-5, we're talking about large sums. And especially now where we're talking about 900 and a million plus. Are those kind of figures used typically in Bitcoin?
Oh, yeah. I think the largest recorded transactions, we've seen $400 million transferred from one wallet to another in the matter of seconds.
Oh, wow. That person made a killing.
Right. So a million will be, I think it's pretty common to see these types of transactions on a Bitcoin network.
Right. Well, Rebecca, we have this issue when we discuss cryptocurrency with regional centers, because we do have this issue where we do have to do checks and make sure that the money doesn't go through money laundering or anything of that nature. Regional centers, are they under an obligation, Rebecca? Do you know?
At this point, they are definitely by any financial institution, any banks that even take cryptocurrency. Those institutions, it must go through all these checks. Regional centers at this point are not considered to have to undergo those checks, but it would be highly advisable for them to do so.
Well, right. Well, a regional center will not be acting as a money transmitter in a way that they're not really touching, Bitcoin or any other type of cryptocurrency. So the transaction will be probably structured through a bank or another licensed, payment processor, and it will be on them to complete proper KYC and AML checks on the client and to make sure that the title to the Bitcoin is clean.
Yeah, so correct. But at the same time, regional centers want to be sure that they're accepting, legitimate funds and just having that second check, doesn't hurt.
Absolutely. And I think what's even more exciting about Bitcoin and other types of crypto is that look, all the transactions are recorded on a public blockchain, right? So for any Bitcoin, you can pull out a title report and see where exactly that Bitcoin was at any given point of time. So if you have a client who has $1 million worth of Bitcoin, it's pretty easy to check at which point of time he got those Bitcoins. So if he told you that he bought it 5 years ago at a given price, it's very easy to check if that Bitcoin was in his wallet 5 years ago and it never moved. So it's actually a lot easier to track source of funds with Bitcoin than with cash.
Rebecca, we mentioned parallel transfers being an issue with USCIS earlier. Just for our audience, could you just describe what a parallel transfer is? And then, Max, perhaps you could comment on whether or not Bitcoin could be utilized in such a transaction.
Yeah, so parallel transfer is when, for instance, China, when before 2017, they were able to transfer 50,000 US dollars. So what they would do is directly transfer their funds to a friend who would directly transfer it to another account they may have open somewhere else outside of China. Parallel transfer, because again, in 2017, they can only now transfer only 7,500 per annum. It's hard to use friends and family, so they would just use one person who would be outside of China who would have 500,000 available. So the petitioner would transfer the funds to the friend in China, and then the person, let's say the friend is in Hong Kong, they would transfer the 500,000 they earned legally to the petitioner, to a Hong Kong account to the petitioner.
Yes, and just like China, we have so many other countries where they have these currency restrictions, like Bangladesh and Vietnam.
Yeah, where Bangladesh, you can't even, $0 can be transferred out.
Right. Max, how could we use Bitcoin or cryptocurrency in such a parallel transfer?
Right. Well, I'm not an expert on in any way in laws in China, but it's interesting that you bring these points up because China is one of the largest miners and producers of Bitcoin in the world. And it's not illegal there. So, I mean...
Yeah, I think the issue
let me give you... I'm sorry, Rebecca, for interrupting you. About a month ago, there was one interesting real estate transaction in New York that involved the sale of a $15 million commercial property in New York. And oddly enough, the purchaser was from China. So they paid $15 million in Bitcoin. And I'm just guessing how they structured it because it was pretty, structured, I guess, in a compliant way in the US. Like the seller had a title company, the transaction was recorded, the banks completed KYC and AML checks probably after the transaction was completed. The title company, I'm sure that they filed the FinCEN report. So that just goes back to your point how the, transactions could be structured.
Well, one of the issues that I see with Bitcoin, one of the problems and difficulties, especially when we're talking about EB-5 investments, is the fact that Bitcoin has an ever-changing exchange value. It doesn't remain static. How do we manage with that?
Well, actually, there is nothing to manage because the regional center never, gets a hold of Bitcoin, or neither does the USCIS. So you are converting Bitcoin into US dollars. So there is no fluctuation risk to anyone.
So basically the fact that there's an ever-changing amount doesn't really matter because what you're saying is that the exchange is done prior to the actual EB-5 transaction.
Right. So it's not like you have Bitcoin sitting on regional centers escrow and it fluctuates back and forth. No, it's not the case.
Well, that's good to know, Max, but are there any other difficulties you see in the use of cryptocurrency?
None.
Well, I guess that was an easy answer.
No, look, it's not a difficulty. This is how you would structure any transaction involving fiat. Just when you're dealing with the client that would like to pay with cryptocurrency, you have to make sure that he can pass KYC and AML checks, and he can establish that the title to his cryptocurrency is let's say clean and it's traceable.
And what happens if someone is using cryptocurrency in a country where really it is prohibited? Again, I mentioned Iceland before. I do know Iceland is one of those countries. I'm not sure of any other countries which have specifically prohibited Bitcoin.
As a U.S. lawyer, I'm not an expert in any shape or form on Iceland laws. I mean, this is something that the client would have to make sure that he complies with. But our job is to make sure that he complies with U.S. laws.
Well, I think the issue that we have to see from our investors coming in, and what I think, Mona, what we would see with USCIS and with the other countries is that, they're not using this as a way to bypass the restrictions, the limit. So, for instance, they have actually regulated and have looked to make sure that you're not just using, the Bitcoins or any other digital wallet out there to go ahead to, exchange funds, for instance, for USCIS. So I think that will be an issue. So I think there you'd have to see, well, were they legitimately investing into Bitcoins or are they just using this as an exchange route?
Yeah, I think USCIS did mention something of that nature because Laurie McKenzie did state in an event, and everybody jumped on that when she stated that USCIS is considering issues involving virtual currencies such as Bitcoin. I think the quote is something like USCIS cannot provide blanket assurances regarding any particular form of transfer, but we will continue to evaluate evidence provided by petitioners to determine whether the relevant statutory and regulatory requirements have been met, including evidence that the funds invested belong to the petitioner and were acquired directly and indirectly and by lawful means. So one of those real kind of blanket statements. But we do see that Bitcoin is on the market.
Right, which is like a pretty, I guess, straightforward standard to satisfy. If you have a client who has a wallet, and so you can establish the source of funds and how they were moving in or outside of the wallet.
Is there a restriction on how much digital currency can be purchased at a time?
No, not that I'm aware of.
In the US, yes. Well, now they have, in New York, for instance, an individual cannot purchase more than $8,000 worth of Bitcoin in a single week. So that would be approximately 21 Bitcoins.
No, but that's probably like a limit on the credit card. There, like no limits on how much. We see transactions that funds are buying and selling, hundreds of millions of dollars of Bitcoin on a daily basis, and OTC transactions.
Rebecca, what kind of RFEs are we seeing with relation to Bitcoin?
Well, because it's so new and because USCIS took so long to adjudicate some of these cases, now we're seeing more and more issues that are being brought up. Max, you mentioned, it's easier to track these Bitcoins, but one of the issues that we're seeing is that it is hard to tie someone's identity to the digital wallets. So, for instance, one of my clients, when he initially purchased Bitcoins, he had a setup and he had his profile. You can connect his email to his picture, to even his address. All that was connected. But the more and more we got delved into him selling and purchasing Bitcoins and trading and even mining, that became an issue because then you're looking into other addresses that are out there. So he may have one or two digital wallets. They may contain several addresses where he's buying and purchasing these Bitcoins. And that becomes a lot harder for us to track to know that these actual Bitcoins belong to the investor.
Well, if I could jump in right there, Rebecca, how would you tackle that, Max?
Rebecca, you are raising an excellent point, and I think it will vary case on case basis because in one case you can have a client who can show that he purchased his or her Bitcoin 5 years ago from an exchange, right? And ever since he has never moved it, so you have one transaction that you can easily prove to the USCIS, right? Versus you have like an active crypto trader who over the past 5 years had, thousands of transactions on multiple exchanges. And in this case, it will be harder to establish, their source of funds.
Yes, that definitely comes into play because our investor did both. He did mining and he did purchase. So it was so easy for us to just show the purchasing of the Bitcoins. We did run into some issues where the specific Bitcoin, so USCIS wants to make sure the specific Bitcoin that you're selling is the same Bitcoin that they're getting the funds for. Just as, for instance, if USCIS wants to make sure the bank account that your funds are located in is the same bank account that you're using for the investment. So that becomes an issue because the digital wallets pull from every address. So you don't know which wallet or which address it's going to come from. So for those who are mining, it becomes a little harder because you have to actually buy equipment, a specialized software to solve problems in order to collect these Bitcoins. You need to explain that to USCIS. It's difficult to prove because, how do you show the funds that you lawfully earned to purchase these software equipment? Then you have to show your time invested in solving these equations in order to obtain the Bitcoin. And it's a lot of ins and outs with the digital world. And so you have to show, for instance, we had to show how exactly our client owned all of these digital wallets and addresses, meaning going in and doing mathematical equations himself to show that and to prove that he actually owned all of these wallets and addresses. Don't ask me to do it. But it's a way that you have to show USCIS, and we've done ways of showing, look, you can't not anyone can also have access to these addresses. Our client has the specific equations to run all of this.
Okay, so in case of a client who is actively trading crypto, right, I don't think it should be much different from a client who's actively trading stocks, right? If I'm trading my stocks, I would probably trading them on 3 or 4 different exchanges or, brokerage accounts. So I should have records of each of my transactions. So you can just pull out all the transactions that you had. You would see all the wallet numbers. And, this way you could establish the source of clients' Bitcoin. In case of mining, of course, it's very new to USCIS, and they're trying to wrap their heads around what is mining and what does it mean to mine a Bitcoin. But to demonstrate a source of funds, you can show that the client paid for the mining equipment. And let's say I purchased 10 computers that are mining day and night my Bitcoin, and those 10 computers are connected to my one wallet. So all the Bitcoins go to that one wallet, and they've been sitting there for the past 2 years without changing hands.
Well, that's a huge advantage, actually, because if, for example, we take somebody who's got, say, a couple of million and it's sitting in an account, it's highly, highly unlikely that $2 million in the account is just sitting there. It's being used for transactions, and we have to show all of those transactions. Whereas what you're suggesting is that the Bitcoin can easily be sitting there for 2 years.
Oh yeah, we have clients that purchased it 5 or 7 years ago. Let's say they spent $100 buying it at 10 cents, and now it's more than 10,000 Bitcoins worth of almost $9 million. So, and they've been haven't been trading them. They've just been sitting on the wallet. So it will be pretty easy to show that here's the wallet, here's our client, and here's the $100 that he initially purchased it for.
Wow. Well, for federal tax purposes, virtual currency, is it treated as property? Do you get taxed in the same way?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The IRS treats Bitcoin and other types of crypto as property. So we have different agencies in the U.S. So let's say Securities and Exchange Commission might treat something as a security. For example, Bitcoin is not a security, it's a commodity. While other types of cryptocurrencies might be security, right? CFTC treats Bitcoin as a commodity. Then we have IRS, which treats it as a property. And at the same time, there are no inconsistencies between these 3 definitions. But of course, if you bought your Bitcoin for $1 and you're selling it today for $9,000, you have a capital gain of almost $8,999, and you have to pay tax on that.
Oh, and what are the additional costs related to mining of Bitcoins and government regulations?
Well, the most expensive piece of mining Bitcoin is electricity. This is the most expensive.
Really? That's it?
Well, electricity, and then I guess comes the equipment, software, and computers to mine it. But electricity, that's an ongoing cost.
So, Max, take us through a quick transaction. We've discussed, obviously, EB-5, but I'd like to know how you really help a client who has money in a country where they have a problem bringing that money into this country, and they want to, say, buy an apartment in Manhattan. What happens?
Well, it will be structured the same way as we have a client from overseas, right? So the first step will be understanding who the client is, right? Running, as I said, regular KYC, know your customer, and anti-money laundering checks on the client to make sure that he's not politically exposed or he has any red flags. So once that is clear, understanding the source of funds that the client used to buy his Bitcoin, then after that, pulling out, as we say, a title report and then Bitcoin to see where it exactly was at any given point of time. We want to make sure that the Bitcoin was not near any illicit exchanges or any illicit wallets that are on the sanctions list. So if that's
interesting.
If that's clear, then we know that we have a client and we can sort of proceed to the next stage, which involves contract, choosing a property, and the standard real estate transaction.
And in the real estate transaction, you would exchange the Bitcoin for dollars prior to actually handing the money over to the seller, yes?
Well, there are 2 ways that you can structure a transaction. The first one, as I said before, maybe there is a seller that does want to accept, Bitcoin.
There are?
Yeah.
And that's legal in the United States?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And actually, we consulted a client. She was selling a condo unit. And as a matter of fact, she wanted to accept her payment in Bitcoin. She was, very bullish on the price. So she said that, let me accept a Bitcoin. So.
Wow, that is new, right, Rebecca?
Yeah. Very much so.
But if the seller sort of does not want to take a risk of for price fluctuation, then yes, the Bitcoin would be converted into US dollars, and the seller will be getting her check or his check at closing. So nothing changes from their perspective.
So Max, we've been talking a lot about Bitcoin, but you also deal in stablecoin, I understand.
Well, not deal. We come across transactions that are structured in stablecoins.
And just for our listeners, quickly, what is a stablecoin?
A stablecoin, it's a digital form of currency that's attached to a dollar. So pretty much it never fluctuates. So if Bitcoin fluctuates and it's a highly volatile asset, you have a digital representation of US dollar in the form of stablecoin.
Hence its name.
Right. And just to put numbers in perspective, right? So the market cap of Bitcoin today it's almost $160 billion. There are, I think, 3 or 4 top stable coins out there. So one of the most favorite ones is Tether, which has a pretty serious, I think, market cap, which is over 5 billion. And, these types of stable coins are used for cross-border transactions or, payments. We see actually companies in Asia are using stable coins to settle payments for export and import.
Primarily, which countries are using these coins?
I think China is very big. Vietnam is big on stable coins. So 80% of all transactions in the US in crypto are Bitcoin and Ether, while more than 80% of all the crypto transactions in Asia are structured through stable coins.
Interesting. Well, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it makes sense because people, like a stable type of cryptocurrency that they can send from one wallet to another to make payments for in commerce. So it's becoming actually a big chunk of a big piece of multinational and cross-border payment systems.
Well, cryptocurrency can be confusing for most, which is why I can see that the stable cryptocurrencies, those tied to a dollar, may have a greater appeal to more people. Well, Max Dilendorf, I appreciate you coming on EB-5 Investment Voice and explaining a lot of these cryptocurrency concerns. I especially enjoyed the challenge of the source of funds issue and the complexity of bookkeeping, even in a digital wallet, the difference between mining and transferring and where those mining activities may have originated from. It's good food for thought, and knowing about that ahead of time will allow applicants to plan for it. It has been a while since we've talked about cryptocurrencies and their applicability to the EB-5 program. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, the last time we covered Bitcoin, it was around $3,000 per Bitcoin. In fact, I just looked it up real quick. That was 2.5 years ago, over 50 episodes ago, back in episode 45, where we talked about using Bitcoin for international transfers. Since then, we've gone through a tremendous bubble and reevaluation and now more stability, as well as USCIS has put in procedures and regulations in place on how it can and can't be used. So I'm really happy that we got to explore these topics again. Max Dilendorf, thank you so much for coming on EB-5 Investment Voice.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you. I learned a lot.
Thank you for being with us today on EB-5 Investment Voice. The topics presented in this podcast is informational in nature and is not to be taken as specific legal advice. If you have questions on the topics presented in this episode or other investment immigration needs, please contact Mona Shaw & Associates. Mona and her attorney staff can be reached at mshawlaw.com. That's mshawlaw.com. Make sure you don't miss our next episode focusing on a different aspect of the EB-5 program by subscribing to the podcast. While you're at it, leave us a rating on iTunes. If you really found this episode valuable, share it with someone else that could benefit from this information. Until then, I'll see you on the next episode of EB-5 Investment Voice.